Good evening, everyone. My name is Noreen Humble, and I'm the acting director of the Calgary Institute for the Humanities. And before we get started with this evening's event, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Blackfoot and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Bigune, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The University of Calgary itself is situated on land adjacent to where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, and the traditional Blackfoot name of this place, which we now call the city of Calgary, is Mohkinstsis. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, and we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. The CIH is the oldest humanities institute in Canada, with a long history of civic engagement and of hosting events which bring groundbreaking scholars and scholarship into conversation with the broader community. From the very beginning, at the core of the Institute are our annual fellowships. These are one-year fellowships given to outstanding faculty members at the University of Calgary. The awards are given to support specific research projects, and they provide the recipient with release from a portion of their teaching obligations and an office in the Institute. Such leave time is crucial for the scholarly output in the field of the humanities. And by bringing together scholars from diverse disciplines, the Institute fosters interdisciplinary connections and a vibrant community of scholars. One of the commitments of these annual fellows is to give a public talk about the research they have been carrying out during their time in the Institute. And tonight we are pleased to be showcasing the work of this year's Naomi Lacey Resident Fellow, Dr. Trevor Stark. The endowed Naomi Lacey Resident Fellowship, along with this annual lecture, is made possible by a generous donation from the Lacey Foundation for the Arts. It was established to honor the memory of Naomi Lacey, whom I'm delighted to say, being one myself, who trained as a classicist and was a passionate advocate of the arts and humanities, serving as a much valued member of the advisory board of the CIH. And it is no exaggeration to say that the generous and steadfast support of the CIH by the wider community is crucial to keeping our programs flourishing and growing. The value of this fellowship extends well beyond its benefit to one individual, enhancing, as it does, the community of fellows in the CIH, which includes graduate students and postdoctoral fellows, and our connections with the community through public events such as this one this evening. And it is therefore my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. John R. Lacey, who will say a few words in a moment. Dr. Lacey is both an iconic oil and gas entrepreneur and a staunch advocate for the arts. He arrived in Calgary from Britain, newly married in 1956. And following a 15-year career with a local oil company, Dr. Lacey started his own international engineering and geological consulting company, which he ran for 45 years before retiring. Together with his late wife, Naomi, he has generously supported many philanthropic causes in Calgary, with particular emphasis on arts organizations, perhaps most notably the Calgary Philharmonic Orchestra. The couple spearheaded the formation of the Friends of the CPO, the Musical Heritage Program, and the Virtuoso Program. Dr. Lacey is also honorary chair and donor to the Ad Astra Capital Campaign, a director for Contemporary Calgary Art Gallery, the founder and sponsor with the National Gallery of Canada of the biannual Lacey Prize for artist-run galleries in Canada. He's chair of MRU's Conservatory Advisory Committee and served as chair of the Friends of the CPO and Musical Heritage from 2000 to 2013. We are truly honored to have him as a patron of the Calgary Institute for the Humanities and the founder of the Naomi Lacey Memorial Lecture. Please welcome him as warmly as you can via this less than ideal medium we are constrained to use in these tough times. Dr. Lacey, I turn it over to you.
Excellent. Well, I'm just going to say it's enormously nice to be involved with the Institute. It was a love of my wife's, and to be able to actually do something tangible to help the Institute follow its directions freely, bring in fellows to study various issues is exactly what she would have wanted. I originally set things up with the Institute basically to cover a 10-year period, but you have some great persuaders at the university, and you're now going to have fellows ad infinitum. So that is good. It's good for the Institute, it's good for Calgary, and I may say it's good for me. And I am just sorry that I'm not at the university with all of you enjoying tonight's lecture, but I hope you'll enjoy it. And maybe next year we can all get together. I certainly hope so. So thank you and enjoy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lacey, for joining us, and not just in spirit here, but also in person, and giving us those wonderful words. We are so grateful to you for endowing this fellowship and making it possible for us to carry on, as you said, ad infinitum with this one. So it's now my further pleasure to introduce you to tonight's speaker, our 2020-21 Naomi Lacey Fellow, Dr. Trevor Stark. Dr. Stark is an assistant professor of art history in the Department of Art and Art History. He completed his PhD in the Department of History of Art and Architecture at Harvard University, and before arriving in Calgary, held fellowships at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Columbia University. His work has appeared in such prestigious journals as Art History, October, Text zur Kunst, and the Burlington Magazine. 2020 was a watershed year for him. His monograph, Total Expansion of the Letter, Avant-Garde Art and Language After Mallarmé, was published by the MIT Press and October Books. He co-edited with Rachel Silveri a special issue of Selva, a journal of the history of art, on the topic Reactionary Art Histories. And he received a 2-year Shirk Insight Development Grant to conduct research on the Dada movement and sociological debates on rationalization in the 1910s and 20s. Tonight, he's going to speak to us about the work he has been carrying out this year at the Institute. It concerns the Belgian artist Marcel Broodthaers, an artist who abandoned an early career as a poet to make the political and financial compromises of culture under capitalism into his medium. We at the Institute have been fortunate to hear a sneak preview of this work, and so I know you're in for a treat this evening. So I will hand things over now to you, Trevor, and just say to everyone in the audience, the chat is disabled. The Q&A is where you can at any time during the talk pop a question in, and Trevor will answer as many as he can at the end when he's finished. So thank you. Over to you, Trevor.
Okay, hello everyone. The artist I'll be speaking about tonight, Marcel Broodthaers, made an art form out of public acknowledgements of patrons, friends, benefactors, and institutions. I don't have quite his talent at the art form, so I'll keep my remarks rather brief. I've been immensely lucky and privileged to live here in Mohkinstsis for almost 4 years on land of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, Stoney Nakoda, and the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. For this invitation to speak tonight, I'm grateful to the Calgary Institute of the Humanities, which is Canada's oldest such institution, and to all those who support the work it does to create a home for thought, art, critical debate, and culture here in Calgary. I believe it to be one of the most vital institutions for the cultural and intellectual life of our province, Alberta. So thank you to the Lacey Foundation for the Arts for its important contribution to ensuring its future. I'd like to thank the director of the CIH, Noreen Humble, for her leadership during my tenure this year, and the other scholars at the CIH for their community, Karen Bourrier, William Bridell, Petra Delata, Victoria Fast, and Neil Sirkin. I'd also like to recognize Sean Lindsay for his work making the center run, fact, making this event run, and for designing the amazing poster for my talk, which I've joked might get sued by the Marcel Broodthaers estate. So thank you to all of you for making it out tonight. I hope you're able to enjoy a glass of wine or dinner while listening to this talk, such as one of the few benefits of these online events. So my aim will be to present the work of Broodthaers, an artist who has perhaps deservedly gotten a reputation for difficulty and obliquity. And I'll focus in particular on some works and issues that I'll be dealing with in my book project, namely poetry and political economy for Broodthaers. How much is an artist worth? Setting aside the metaphysical subtleties of the question, the Belgian artist Marcel Broodthaers attempted to get a straight answer in the manner of an accountant drawing up a balance sheet in Gedicht, Poème, Change, Exchange, Wechsel, a print from 1973. Hundreds of tiny initials reading MB are arrayed under the trilingual headings in the title, sorted into numbered groupings, and then assigned value in several currencies. In this aesthetic exchange bureau, the commodity scrutinized, tabulated, and assigned value is the artist's signature. Being that it is also an artwork by Broodthaers, it might be considered a self-portrait. One, however, in which the artist does not gaze upon their own countenance, but seeks to quantify and measure their social value objectively, like a bank balance or a credit score. The work further promises, through its very bureaucratic appearance, to facilitate exchange between poetry and art, between English, German, and French, between Deutschmarks, French francs, British pounds, and American dollars, and finally between aesthetic and financial value as such. Yet the relations between the apparently irreconcilable taxonomies of language, art, money, and identity founder in arbitrariness and absurdity. The number of initials in the different sections do not add up. A poem consisting of only initials and numbers would not require translation. And the price assigned to the MB asset bundles in various foreign currencies are irredeemably discrepant. The work provokes rather foolish questions from the viewer. If £1 would buy you 1.03 initials and one Deutschmark would buy you 1.59 initials, does this mean that Broodthaers' reputation is better on the German art market than the British one? Considering that all these tabulations constitute together an artwork by Marcel Broodthaers, produced in an edition of 100 and offered for sale on the international art market, and authenticated with an additional signed initial at the bottom of each print, this print lapses into tautology. MB is at once the commodity measured, the unit of measurement, and also the authorizing agent, guaranteeing the legitimacy of the exchange. This is the uncertain ground upon which Broodthaers seems to stake his art practice and perhaps even his subjectivity. The print also names the twin poles of this talk's analysis of Broodthaers, poetry and exchange. Their conjunction seems to restate the 19th century poet Stéphane Mallarmé's dictum, quote, "Everything is summed up between aesthetics and political economy," end quote. The status of both poetry and political economy in Broodthaers' work is notoriously difficult to parse, and it's worth dwelling briefly upon each of these in my introductory remarks. From his first publications in Belgian revolutionary surrealist magazines in the 1940s, Broodthaers presented himself as a poet. And when he made his entry into art production in 1964, as we'll see, he publicly bid farewell to the vocation of poetry. And yet, at the most basic level, the art that he went on to produce until his death in 1976 was suffused with language. Its visual substance was made up of fragments of the poetic. Furthermore, as this talk will demonstrate, one of his primary topoi as an artist was the history of poetry, primarily the history of French modernist poetry of the late 19th century. This talk will center on a series of artworks in which he appropriated the words and works of long dead poets, and in some cases repackaged the physical objects of their publications themselves. In each of these cases, the status of modernist poetry in Broodthaers' work was called into question, often persisting only as ruin or absence. Acting as an aesthetic sociologist of sorts, I'll argue, Broodthaers set out to analyze the uneven historical development of poetry and visual art under a triumphant post-war capitalism. In the late 1960s and mid-70s, Broothaers observed the successful amalgamation of the institutions of art into the entertainment industry, the trade in luxury commodities, and the financial markets for speculative investment. Poetry, in comparison, had not been able to adapt itself to the requirements of capital. It persisted ghost-like as a marginal preoccupation, useless to the bottom line. It's in this context that Broothaers proclaimed himself no longer a poet, but an artist who made artworks about poetry. Broothaers' politics are no less paradoxical. He worked as a messenger for the Belgian resistance during the Second World War while in his 20s, and he was a member of the Belgian Communist Party from 1943 to 51. Against the party and the major unions, Broothaers participated in the wave of protests and occupations of May 1968, in particular working as a negotiator for activists who had occupied the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Brussels. And yet his notoriously hermetic artworks seem to deny themselves the possibility of clear political speech, let alone the possibility of a vantage point outside capitalism from which to denounce it. Instead, he insisted on his own compromised and constrained position. He summed it up in a text from 1975, which gives this talk its title. The political position I'm trying to defend in art is weak, individual first of all, and subject to the pressures and influence of a specialist public where middlemen and collectors play a big part, end quote. My book project, and more modestly this talk, seek to clarify the coordinates of Broothaers' weak politics of art. I argue that the key term for grasping both the critical conception of capitalism that Broothaers deployed and its relevance for art is reification. As I'll show, following his participation in a seminar with the Marxist philosopher and literary theorist Lucian Goldman in 1969, Broothaers begins to use the term reification and to name specifically its originator, the Hungarian communist philosopher George Lukács. In 1975, he asked, "What is art? I doubt, in fact, that it's possible to give a serious definition of art unless we examine the question in terms of a constant. I mean the transformation of art into a commodity. The process is accelerated nowadays to the point where artistic and commercial values have become superimposed. If we're concerned with the phenomenon of reification, then art is a particular representation of this phenomenon, a form of tautology." The statement is complex. Broothaers describes a total social process of boundless commodification, of which art is a particular case, which he names reification. The term entered the Marxist lexicon in 1923 with the publication of Lukács' History and Class Consciousness, a book whose impact far exceeds Broothaers', shaping as it did tendencies from the Frankfurt School to the Situationist International. In the original German, reification is Verdinglichung, which means literally to make thingly. And yet, as we'll see, Lukács' analysis was not limited to a particular class of objects. Instead, his was an avowedly totalizing analysis of the capitalist world, centered on the radical expansion of what he called the principle of the commodity, to the point where it became what he called universal category of society as a whole, end quote. Under reification, Lukács argued, the economy not only wins its autonomy from the rest of society, functioning according to an abstract rationality of its own, it not only begins to seem more real than any non-economic spheres of life, but it actually becomes more real or objective as societies reorganized according to the ever more stringent principles of management and rationalization designed to facilitate the accumulation of capital. The result is a world in which the exchange of the commodity becomes a quasi-natural law governing human society, rather than a social form specific to capitalism as a historical stage that might be overcome. The question I believe Broothaers' art posed was how to and why to continue to make art at all if one accepts this vision of the totality. Broothaers' answer took the form of a weak aesthetic politics. It was an art made out of the negotiations, disappointments, deflations, and defeats of attempting to maintain art and poetry at all in the age of reification. In other words, he transformed the political compromises and financial entanglements of culture under capitalism into his medium. A narrower question will occupy us for the remainder of this talk. What is the relationship between poetry and reification in Broothaers' works? In an interview from 1971, he noted mournfully, quote, "Poetic reality is over, I'm sorry to say. What's left? A pessimism and a museum, which gives one something to think about as a place of communication and not a shelter for works of art." This statement names the other major project of Broothaers' life, which I will bracket for today's talk, the Museum of Modern Art, Department of Eagles, a fictional museum that he directed from 1968 to 72. This haunting vision of the so-called end of poetic reality was a matter of personal experience. No introduction of Broothaers' art can do without the story of the artist's spectacular or pathetic entry into art making. In 1964, at the age of 40, Broothaers staged his first exhibition as an artist at the Galerie Saint-Laurent in Brussels. Two works in particular have come to constitute something like a manifesto for Broothaers' career, namely the sculpture on screen here, Pense Bête, and an artist statement, which we'll read together in a few moments. In Pense Bête, Broothaers ensconced the unsold copies of his most recent volume of poems in plaster and transformed them by rendering them unreadable into a sculpture. Thus, poetry became art at the cost of its linguistic and semantic content. With this object, he publicly announced the end of his identity and profession as a poet and his entry into that of the artist. Broothaers later described this artistic proposition, as he called it, as the, quote, final burial of poetry or prose, end quote. It was further, he noted, an unmourned death, for he recalled of the opening reception, no one had any curiosity about the text. Pense Bête also proposed a revaluation of the poem's commodity status as it became interred in art. If his book of poetry was a relatively cheap commodity, the poems that it contained are not, strictly speaking, commodities at all. In general, a poem may be sold as a commodity, in a book, for example, but the poem itself is not coextensive with its commodity status. For it may be recited, Xeroxed, memorized, copied out, and so on, with no diminishment whatsoever to its aesthetic substance as a poem. But Broothaers' gesture in Pense Bête, the sculpture, was to contain poetry in the material substrate of an object made to be sold on the market, a commodity. Broothaers announced his fiscal motivations in a text letterpress printed on magazine pages, distributed as an invitation and pasted to the gallery facade. And it's a rather strange order to the reading, so I'll read it and translate it into English, starting here. I too wondered whether I could not sell something and succeed in life. For some time, I've been a good for nothing. I'm 40 years old. Finally, the idea of inventing something insincere crossed my mind, and I got to work right away. After 3 months, I showed my production to Philippe-Édouard Toussaint, the owner of the Galerie Saint-Laurent. Well, it's art, he said, and I'm willing to exhibit all of it. Okay, I responded. If I sell something, he'll take 30%. These are, it seems, the normal conditions. Some galleries take 75%. What is it? Basically, they're objects. End quote. We may ask again, confronted with these two objects, this manifesto and Pense Bête, how much is an artist worth? Broothaers' answer seems to be very little, but more at least than a poet. Broothaers insisted on the economic vector between poetry and the artwork repeatedly. Asked a decade later in an interview whether he ever made politically engaged art, he answered, I did once. They were poems, concrete signs of engagement since they were without compensation. The correlative thesis was Broothaers' frequent, almost nonchalant proposal that our art was objectively a political nullity. I choose to consider art as useless labor, apolitical, and of little moral significance, Broothaers wrote. His stance, absurd and poignant, was that of someone pushed into art by market forces while remaining ruefully fixated on the ruins of poetry. Already in this first exhibition, then, Broothaers measured the commodity status of poetry against that of art. setting in play a dialectic of devaluation and revaluation as both forms are subjected to the law of the market. For Broodthaers, on the one hand, poetry is devalued in relation to art. Poetry is an economically nebulous preoccupation for a raté, a good for nothing, stuck in the past. And art promises the entry into a higher rung of commodity exchange. And yet, on the other hand, art is thereby devalued in relation to poetry. The artwork, whatever its form or content, is a luxury commodity, which, as he put it, quote, hangs on our bourgeois walls as a sign of power, end quote. And radical aspirations in art appear either insincere or naive. Conversely, the poem, whatever its form or content, attains a heroic status, radically unreconciled to economic integration at the cost of the poet's ability to sustain themselves. Broodthaers extended these concerns back into the history of poetry with a book published as part of a show in Antwerp titled Literary Exhibition Concerning Mallarmé. In this book, Broodthaers appropriated wholesale the first edition of Mallarmé's iconic visual poem, Un coup de dé jamais n'abolira le hasard, or A throw of the dice never will abolish chance. This poem was finished in 1897 and published posthumously in 1914 by the Nouvelle Revue Française. On the cover, Broodthaers replaced Mallarmé's name with his own, as we see in the bottom corner here, and the word poème with image. On the first pages, the entirety of Mallarmé's poem is condensed into paragraphs of prose, eliminating the carefully calibrated visual distribution of words across pages that made Mallarmé's poem legendary. In the remaining pages of the book, Broodthaers carefully respected Mallarmé's dynamic typographical layout, but replaced each line of text with a black bar. Thus, Mallarmé's poem persists as though redacted, transformed into a book-length abstract image. For the exhibition, he produced 3 editions of the book, including one on transparent paper, which I'm showing you on the screen here, and also a unique version of the poem impressed on 12 anodized aluminum plates. Broodthaers proclaimed concurrently with this exhibition that Mallarmé was, quote, that Mallarmé's poem was, quote, the manifesto of contemporary art made in the 19th century, end quote. He further qualified this statement by noting that, quote, Mallarmé is the source of contemporary art. He unconsciously lived in modern space, end quote. What drew Broodthaers in particular to the space of the poem? And given what we know about Broodthaers' belief that contemporary art demonstrated the total superimposition of commercial and artistic values, is it possible that his claim that Mallarmé stood at its source was far from unequivocal? What did he seek to accomplish by reifying, that is to say, by objectifying, the interplay of text so carefully established by Mallarmé? In his preface, Mallarmé described the poem's distinct typographical sizes and emphases, indicating multiple and intertwining lines of text as a, quote, spatialization of reading, in which, quote, the paper intervenes each time an image of its own, end quote. While the ostensible subject of this poem, Un coup de dé, is the desperate act of a character known as le maître, the master or ship's captain, who shakes 2 dice in his fist, hesitating to throw them as he goes down in a shipwreck. The main protagonist of the poem is, in many ways, readers themselves, who navigate the multiple paths opened up by the text. They could, for example, follow the train of large capitals spread out throughout the pages to reconstruct the title. Un coup de dé, jamais, n'abolira le hasard. A throw of the dice never will abolish chance. Or they might focus on the secondary line in small capitals. Rien n'aura eu lieu que le lieu, excepté peut-être une constellation. Nothing will have taken place but the place, except perhaps a constellation. These words allegorize the poem as an empty stage for the reader's performance. The poem's dialectic between signifying plenitude and absence is intensified by Broodthaers' gesture of preserving the poem's layout, but replacing the words with black bars. From one point of view, the version on translucent paper realizes and expands upon Mallarmé's desire for a, quote, simultaneous vision of the page. as he puts it in the preface. Broothaers allows for a simultaneous vision through the pages. And yet, from another point of view, especially in the version on aluminum plates, the visuality and plasticity of language, rather than activating and volatilizing the process of reading, as Mallarmé hoped, prohibits it. What, first of all, had been the aim of Mallarmé's spatialization of language in Our Coup d'Idée? From the vantage point of the late 19th century, Mallarmé believed that poetic language was the enemy of reification, though he would not have used that particular word. The Mallarméan stance with respect to objectification may be brutally summarized in 3 stages of a dialectic. First, poetic language takes up a negative or destructive relationship to the world of objects outside. Poetry would be the act, as Mallarmé put it, of, quote, transposing a fact of nature into its vibratory near disappearance according to the play of language, end quote. Second, language would thereby attain a material quality of its own, as it does in this poem, seemingly becoming a thing among things, culminating in his typographical experiments. This would interrupt the extraction of meaning and bar any transitive relationship between the word and the world. Third, finally, from this negation of the negation, poetry would defeat its own objectification and form mobile constellations of sound and sense. Quote, it's just language playing, the poet insisted. Mallarmé's poetics opposed the reigning social use of language under capitalism. Under this system, he asserted, language was reduced to, quote, its function as cash, direct and representational, end quote. What precisely did Mallarmé mean by this pecuniary treatment of language? He argued that language operated according to a transactional model in which words were passed from an agent to a recipient in order to produce a desired effect under capitalism. As he put it, suffice perhaps, in order to exchange human thought, to take or to put into someone else's hand in silence a coin. Thus, for Mallarmé, this use of language was a natural complement to an ever-ascendant capitalist political economy in which language itself, he believed, was assimilated to disappointed bankers, subject to declines and reversals in the stock exchange, with the effect of reducing to a level of business, a situation expressly prepared to cast everything into play, end quote. His poetry, conversely, sought to disrupt this conception of language as a medium of exchange between atomized subjects on the market. Mallarmé carefully constructed his poems to defy the extraction of singular meaning. Instead, he hoped that the reader would experience a moment of vacillation or doubt before language. Thus, to read and to write poetry would incarnate a form of labor, quote, labor that cannot be paid by the product, perhaps because it admits hesitation. The space of the poem would be then a level playing field between reader and writer, both implicated in a non-deterministic, non-commodifiable relationship with the structures of communication. It's this historical project, to maintain poetic language as a force of mobility set against objectification, that Broothaers meditates upon mournfully. In an open letter on the occasion of the publication of this book, Broothaers wrote, quote, today I make this image. I say farewell, long-term lived. Farewell one and all, late men of letters, dead artists, end quote. Mallarmé himself was constantly aware of this inevitable defeat. Quote, for me, the case of the poet in this society that does not permit him to live is the case of a person who isolates himself to sculpt his own grave, end quote. Broothaers' book could be considered a tomb for the modernist legacy of Mallarmé, its final objectification. The mobile temporality of reading is frozen into empty space. This objectification is also a reification, as Broothaers thus redeems poetry as an economically viable proposition in the sale of this artwork. It's with this in mind that one should read with an important formulation given in an interview he conducted with himself in 1974. Quote, the interminable search for a definition of space serves only to hide the essential structure of art, a process of reification. Any individual who perceives a function of space, especially a convincing one, appropriates it mentally or economically. The category of space is indeed central to Lukács's description of the economic appropriation of the world, which he calls reification. Lukács describes reification as a process that, quote, degrades time to the dimension of space, end quote. In a famous characterization of factory labor, Lukács writes, quote, time sheds its qualitative, variable, flowing nature. It freezes into an exactly delimited, quantifiable continuum filled with quantifiable things. The reified, mechanically objectified performance of the worker, wholly separated from his total human personality. In short, it becomes space, end quote. In the ever more precise rationalization and management of labor, Lukács argues, with Bergsonian implications, that the qualitative movement of time in human experience is quantified and spatialized. The time of one's life becomes an alienable commodity, the only thing owned by the mass of humanity, that one must sell on the market for a wage. Most importantly, human labor time is abstracted, averaged out, and congealed, as Marx put it, in the value of the commodity. Thus, reification sets into play mysterious relationships between the concrete and the abstract, for both the human subject and the commodity. From the point of view of the worker, as Lukács put it, just as time is transformed into abstract, exactly measurable physical space, the subjects of labor must likewise be rationally fragmented, end quote. From the point of view of the material things produced to serve human uses, use values, as Marx calls them, there's a second order objectification that occurs. Lukács insists, quote, even the individual object which man confronts directly, either as producer or consumer, is distorted in its objectivity by its commodity character. When use values appear universally as commodities, they acquire a new objectivity, a rational objectification that conceals above all their immediate qualitative and material character of things as things, end quote. The objectivity of a thing, its organic unity, as Lukács would call it, might once have been rooted in its material character or social use. And yet, under capitalism, the material qualities of the particular thing qua thing are secondary to its primary function qua commodity, that is, to realize economic value in exchange. Its objectivity is its price. In the interview quoted above, Broothaers asks himself, quote, what does space conceal? Isn't it like a game of hide and seek? He answers, of course, the one who is hiding will always say he's somewhere else, and you know he'll turn around and catch someone. The interminable search for a definition of space serves only to hide the essential structure of art, a process of reification. Likewise, the paradox of reification for Lukács is that what appears most objective and real under capitalism is an abstraction. The whole system of money, price, exchange value, and value. And this abstraction not only mystifies, but concretely shapes the realities of human time, labor, and our relation to objects of use. Broothaers extends this analysis to the space of the artwork. Here, he suggests the art object's sensuous materiality, its object-like quality, its space, in other words, might serve to conceal or hide its social reality as a commodity. But it does not, however, exempt it from reification. Broothaers must have nodded in dire agreement as he read Lukács' note, quote, even in art, we find the same unbridgeable gap opening up between subject and object that we find confronting us everywhere in modern life. And art can do no more than shape this problematic without, however, finding a real solution to it, end quote. Broothaers likewise insisted that despite all appearances that seem to differentiate the artwork from the average commodity, it too has indelibly been shaped by a world rationalized for commodity exchange. Quote, there can be several theories in art, Broothaers concluded, but only one common practice, which is that of the commodity. The theory-practice relationship will be neutralized on this political level. If Broothaers insists on the artwork as a tautological mirror of the commodity, what then is the role of poetry in this system? On the one hand, Broothaers fixates on moments in the history of modern poetry in which poetry seemed, despite itself, to anticipate and even to crave its own objectification, such as the spatialization of verse produced by Mallarmé. And yet, on the other hand, Broothaers also insists that poetry was an irreducible remainder to the equation of art and commodity. For poetry was a casualty of reification, an economic nullity in a world where every practice must justify its existence on the market. Broothaers' gesture was to preserve the ruin of poetry in the artwork as something dead, but perhaps resistant. In order to account for the relationship between poetic language and reification in Broothaers, we should dwell on his encounter with Lucien Goldman in a seminar on Baudelaire held over the winter of 1969 to 70. Goldman was the founder of the Center for the Sociology of Literature at the Université Libre de Brussels. Although his stature has receded today, Goldman was a major figure of the Francophone intellectual left in the 50s and 60s. And he almost single-handedly was responsible for rescuing the reputation of the young Lukács. Goldman, for example, in a very important essay from 1959 titled Reification, wrote, quote, "What we designate by the term reification is in the first instance the appearance in social life of economic processes specifically as autonomous and purely quantitative phenomena." He continued, "The process of reification extends over and penetrates into the interior of all non-economic sectors of thought and affect. Religion, morality, art, literature in the capitalist world are hollowed out from inside by the appearance of an autonomous economic system that takes hold of all manifestations of human life." End quote. This description of the hollowing out of formerly autonomous sectors of life, including art and literature, by reification, cannot but call to mind Broothaers' emptied out un coup d'idée. In the wake of this seminar, Broothaers produced another artwork in the name of Baudelaire. Its cover bears no marks of the Belgian artist's authorship, only Baudelaire's name and a title, Je hais le mouvement qui déplace les lignes. I hate the movement that displaces lines. The book's contents can be summarized very briefly. The opening page features an assortment of figure numbers and letters in an ornamental calligraphic font. The following spread, labeled Figure 1, reproduces a sonnet by Baudelaire titled La Beauté, which was published in Les Fers du Mal in 1857, and which features this title line of Broothaers' book set off in bright red. This title phrase then extends across the following 8 pages, one word at the bottom of each page, topped by a smattering of figs. The final 3 pages feature an alternative version of Baudelaire's poem, a colophon providing fetishistic information about the book for collectors, and a note from the artist, the only time Broothaers' name appears in the book, which reads, quote, "This book has its origin in a seminar by Lucien Goldman on Baudelaire, held in Brussels during the winter of 1969 to 70, in which I was invited to participate as an artist, Marcel Broodthaers." The putative subject of the book, Baudelaire's poem La Beauté, is precisely about poetry's magnetic and self-destructive drive to objectify itself. The poem begins with a first-person statement, "I am beautiful, O mortals, like a dream of stone." Who is speaking in this poem? It becomes clear as one reads that it's not the poet, not Baudelaire himself, but beauty herself who speaks. Beauty is gendered and beauty is desired, but she is scarcely human. Instead, she describes herself as, quote, "a dream of stone," one that inspires in poets, quote, "a love eternal and mute like matter." Like an uncomprehended sphinx with a heart of snow, Beauty appears in the poem like a marble statue, an immovable object of sterile materiality and cold whiteness. Poets, she claims, bruise themselves on her stone breast, but she is impervious to them. She is opposed in every way to mortality and life. She is silent like matter itself, eternal and mute. And she despises the movement that displaces lines. This movement is precisely what separates her from the living. Her lines, like those of a Greek statue, are eternally and perfectly fixed, indifferent to the frenetic movement of the creatures around her. Baudelaire's poem takes on a further self-reflexive significance if we consider the verdict of the critic Jacques Rivière, who noted in 1910 that, quote, every Baudelaire poem is a movement. It is never at a standstill. It is not an immobile description, end quote. Thus, Baudelaire's poem expresses a hatred of poetic movement from the point of view of beauty, presented as a force of immobile objectification and reification, one that attracts and negates poetry. Significantly for our purposes, according to a student's transcription, Lucian Goldman discussed this particular poem in his seminar on Baudelaire. Though we may not be certain that Broothaers attended every session, it does give a glimpse into the sort of analysis that he would have encountered there, and why he would name the seminar as the origin of this book. What, Goldman asked, led Baudelaire to identify beauty with a hatred of movement? Goldman answered, quote, what interests me is that the concept of beauty becomes for Baudelaire either that which negates life, the immobile, the metallic, the fountain, the stone, or evil, the prise de position from within contradiction, end quote. Goldman's answer to this question is that the poet's quest for beauty, infinity, and eternity tears them from the world of the here and now, which is comparatively judged as inadequate by definition. This splenetic disenchantment, as Goldman calls it, leads the Baudelairean poet to hate the world in the name of beauty. But in a typically satanic inversion, Goldman argues that for Baudelaire, hatred thus comes to define beauty. Beauty negates life. In a further dialectical twist for Baudelaire, the only access that the living poet has to beauty is at those sites that transgress and destroy the world as it exists. In Baudelaire's poems, these are maggots swelling in the belly of a rotting corpse. It is a caged rat tormented by a cruel child. It is, quote, hospital, brothel, purgatory, hell, prison, where all enormity blooms like a flower, end quote. In this inverted beauty, Goldman proposed, Baudelaire identifies himself poetically and politically with all the forces of revolt that seek to overturn the reified world. Broothaers' book takes up this same source material in Baudelaire, but comes to opposite conclusions. In Goldman's reading, Baudelaire's aspiration toward the objectification of beauty founded a principle of poetic revolt. In Broothaers, conversely, this same aspiration ends in the transformation of the poem into an artwork and into a commodity. Just as his Un coup de dé freezes the dynamic mobility of lines into an abstract image, Je hais le mouvement traps poetic movement and the temporality of reading in the visual space of the limited edition artist's book. In the book, poetic language further enters into a system of endless circulation via the word or the sign fig or figure. Fig is the quintessential word for Broothaers. Its function is to point outward from the text to an image or an illustration contained elsewhere in the pages of the book. It is in itself an empty linguistic sign for what can't be said in words. Yet in Broothaers' book, the fig callouts are manifestly dysfunctional. They instead tautologically point only to one another and establish relations of reciprocity that have no function but to mark out the discursive and physical space of the book. Remarking on his omnipresent use of the figure sign, Broothaers stated, quote, It was a hypocritical lamentation about the destruction of the object by linguistics, and at the same time an attempt to correlate the figure as a visual representation of a form and the figure as a representation of language. Broothaers thus sets up a history of poetic objectification. In Baudelaire, poetry was paradoxically animated by an ideal of deathly objectification. In Mallarmé, the virtuality of language destroyed the object in the world in order to reclaim its own objecthood and render language mobile. But in Broothaers, the poetic language itself is transformed into a perfectly self-referential, almost hermetically sealed artwork, a visual representation of language coterminous with the commodity. This dynamic can be witnessed in another artwork that takes the form of a book, appropriated from literary history. In 20 ans après, made the same year as the Mallarmé book, 1969, Broothaers repackaged 2 paperback volumes of Alexandre Dumas' sequel to Les Trois Mousquetaires, 20 ans après, with a red wraparound paper reading Broothaers and R. Lucas Éditeur. The first volume has a flyleaf pasted in the front cover with a short and possibly fictional interview between the artist and the publisher, the gallerist Richard Lucas. Returning to the self-deprecating meditation on his failed career as a poet begun at the Galerie Saint-Laurent, the interview focuses on Broothaers and Lucas's activities 20 years prior, when Broothaers was still a poet. Asked about his finances as a poet, Broothaers responds, quote, 20 years ago, I was quite incapable of understanding the meaning of money, end quote. He then asks Lucas, is there a fundamental relationship between art and the commodity, end quote. The gallerist responds, yes, if the quality is good enough, end quote. Broothaers then answers his own question by confessing that he has written the present book, quote, to do signings and establish this art/commodity relationship, end quote. Thus, he restates the dialectic of his manifesto of insincerity. The artwork cannot escape its condition as a commodity, but it holds within itself the memory of poetry as an activity that, as Mallarmé put it, cannot be paid by the product. Each of these books on writers, Mallarmé, Baudelaire, Dumas, constitute meditations on objectification and emptying. Not only as language is fixed into the form of an image or commodity, but as a literary heritage, as literary heritage is transformed into a husk that may be inhabited, not unlike a shell of a mussel or egg. Further, each of these books reduces the writer to the proper name, a historical process in which Baudelaire, Dumas, Mallarmé posthumously become, in today's parlance, brands with a definite market value. The absurdity of 20 ans après, in particular, is to produce an artwork that is nothing but packaging, nothing but the proper name Broothaers superimposed over Dumas' name. To grasp 20 ans après as literature, one must read both volumes of Dumas' book. But to grasp 20 ans après as an artwork by Marcel Broodthaers, one word suffices, the artist's name. The textual substance of the book is set as though into brackets, not effaced, but merely taken out of play. It becomes a block of matter around which a wrapper can be affixed for sale. The proper name establishes the value of the commodity. This reduction of the proper name at the moment of commodification echoes one of the most pernicious effects of reification for Lukács, namely the individualization and self-objectification of the human subject. Indeed, perhaps the great originality of Lukács' concept of reification, as well as one of its most controversial claims, is that it describes a totally integrated social system that shapes the consciousness of both proletariat and bourgeois. Lukács affirms, quote, the problems of consciousness arising from wage labor were repeated in the ruling class in a refined and spiritualized, but for that very reason, more intensified form, end quote. Just as industrial factory labor parceled up lived time into exchangeable units, so too does the bureaucrat, manager, intellectual, or even the artist or to use today's anachronistic term, the creative worker, so too do these people voluntarily quantify and objectify their consciousness, creativity, and even moral faculties, viewing these faculties as separable from their total personality and put on sale on the market. As Lukács writes, quote, "The specialized virtuoso, the vendor of his objectified and reified faculties, lapses into a contemplative attitude vis-a-vis the workings of his own objectified and reified faculties." We might, in closing, return to where we began with the artist's signature. Immediately following the Goldman Seminar, Broodthaers made a second film in the name of Baudelaire. A Second of Eternity, after an idea by Charles Baudelaire, 1970, gives authorial credit to Baudelaire, yet consists of nothing other than Broodthaers' affirmation of his own authorship through the writing of his initials. He painstakingly broke up his signature into 24 stages, each photographed in turn, and then accelerated it into a single cinematic second projected on an infinite loop. The film almost literalizes Lukács' description of reification, in which, quote, "The personality can do no more than look on helplessly while its own existence is reduced to an isolated particle that is fed into an alien system," end quote. With his MBs cyclically returning like parts on a production line, Broodthaers positions art making as a process whereby the subject objectifies the atomized parts of their personality and contemplates them as they're animated quasi-autonomously in exchange. This notion seems to have struck Broodthaers as early as 1945, when he later claimed to an interviewer that he first conceived of a newspaper consisting only of the initials MB divided into columns and headlines that he would sell on the steps of the stock exchange in Brussels, calling out, "Buy the Broodthaers, buy the Broodthaers." It's at this point, with the wholesale identity of the artwork with the name of the artist, that the superimposition of artistic and commercial values into reification is accomplished. For Lukács, the human subject's attitude toward the finite time of our lives, toward our own productive capacities, and toward our own ability to intervene in history, this becomes individualistic and contemplative. As Goldman argued, though historical change is affected by a we and not an I, the phenomenon of reification tends to hide this we and transform it into a collection of different individuals isolated from one another, end quote. Narcissistic self-objectification is thus yet another aesthetic byproduct of reification. In an interview from 1971 about this film, The Second of Eternity, Broodthaers wrote, quote, "I think the basis of artistic creation rests on a narcissistic foundation. The film is called Une Seconde d'Éternité. It's more or less inspired by the work of Baudelaire. It seems to me that the author's signature, be it that of an artist, a filmmaker, or a poet, whatever, it seems to me to be the beginning of a system of lies that all poets, all artists try to establish to defend themselves. I don't know exactly against what," end quote. The narcissistic reflection of the self in the artwork is a crucial theme in Baudelaire, for whom, quote, "An artist is an artist only on the condition of being double," end quote. For Broodthaers, the artist's narcissism constitutes the artwork as a mirror. Quote, "I look at myself in the film as if in a mirror," end quote. But further, under conditions of universal alienation, the very self-objectification of the artwork tautologically mirrors the social reality of reification. As early as 1961, while still struggling as a poet, 3 years prior to his entry to art making, Broodthaers mourned in an article, quote, "Poets have never wanted to acknowledge what they are. And at the same time, society uses them like a shop sign, like a false name for its commodities," end quote. Broodthaers confronted the question of how to continue to make art in a social reality that renders obscene what he called the privilege of art, with deadly serious irony. If Broodthaers insisted that art was, quote, "useless labor, apolitical and scarcely moral," he also insisted on a correlative proposition for his artwork. Quote, "It has the objective of defending art in its uselessness," end quote. Capitalism, since Broothaers' time, has continued to function as though it believes its utopian promise that the market is not only the best, but the only objective means for determining social value. Capital is unable to conceive of any object, institution, social form, idea, life, or natural resource as possessing an end in itself, and instead everywhere substitutes its own singular end, that of infinite accumulation. Broothaers gives a precise name to this condition: reification. The dark humor that shades Broothaers' pessimism, however, suggests that what capitalism figures as vanity, superfluity, or uselessness is that which cannot wholly be reconciled to its system of value. Broothaers' art promises in deadpan to reify poetry, history, the artwork, and even the creative subject itself, in order to sell them as commodities and to stop being a good for nothing. Their tragic comedy asks what we would lose if the equation of art and commodity truly were tautological, if art's promise to generate thought, historical knowledge, and non-instrumentalized forms of experience were actually fully reconcilable with the ends of the market. We can only agree with Broothaers in closing, who noted, quote, "Urged on by some base inspiration, I confess I would experience a kind of pleasure at being proved wrong," end quote. And that's the end of my talk. I'd be happy at this point to entertain any questions. I believe you can put the questions into the Q&A box if there happen to be any.
While people are working that out, Trevor, I'll just pop in and say thank you so much for that. It's so interesting, and I'm glad to have had a second go at all this. And I just a very lightweight question, really, while people are gathering their thoughts. Did his second career create any interest in his poetry?
That's a very good question. In historical hindsight, absolutely. And now the first editions of Broothaers' books of poetry from the early 60s, late 50s and early 60s are very collectible items, as you might imagine. He lived a very short, tragically short life. He became an artist, as he put it, in '64. And he died in 1976. So there's only 11 years of 11 full years of artwork. And in that short time, he made a big impact in the small world, the small marginal world of avant-garde art. He, in his last year of life, had multiple retrospectives at multiple museums in England and Germany in particular. But it really is only, honestly, in the past few decades, really, that his art has really gotten I think the recognition that it very well deserves. In 2016, he had a retrospective, of course, many years after his death, at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, and that really put the final mark on his acceptance into history, and great irony, now his market valuation, right, which is of course through the roof after a MoMA exhibition. And at the same time as MoMA put on the show, further irony that I think Broothaers would have appreciated, the clothing brand Uniqlo put out Marcel Broodthaers t-shirts as a kind of a branding opportunity for the exhibition. I own two, I must confess. And so yeah, Broodthaers, he was not a purist, right? And so he would not have he as we heard, never considered himself to be living in some sort of space outside of the market where he could launch a pure critique. He knew he was compromised. He knew that there was no escape, and he tried to make his art about these entanglements. So I think I see some numbers in the Q&A here. Okay, wow, some great questions. And I have to also say that Marcel Broodthaers put out a couple of interviews with himself as sort of small publications. And so I think I'll probably do something similar here and ask questions the others opposed to myself and then answer them myself. Hopefully there will be some degree of humor in this, not just strange absurdity. So let's start with the first one. What relevance, if any, has his work re-reification, his work's re-reification, I would say probably, and the commodity had on contemporary artists? If I'm interpreting you correctly, I would potentially his market success event in posthumously, or something like that, or at least his historical reputation. What impact has this had? Well, the book that I showed, the Mallarmé book, the Un coup de image, has really come down as, well, first as a cult object of sorts among conceptual artists in particular. And now it's certainly one of the, I think, generally accepted as one of the most important artist books of the 60s. And so it did, in hindsight now, has a big impact. And I know there are several artists who've made their own kind of versions of Broodthaers' version of Mallarmé's Un coup de dé. So it's kind of it is kind of a cult object. Broodthaers at the time, I'm trying to understand your question too, is the impact on contemporary artists. Well, he had a huge impact on his own contemporaries, friends of his, such who have come down now as major artists from the period, like Daniel Buren, who was close with Broodthaers, to give one example. And so yeah, he was at the center of a art world of neo-avant-garde art practices in the 60s that really grappled with the boom in the art market, which in hindsight, the boom in the art market in the 60s and 70s seems quaint today, when I won't even want to get into this topic, but today when crypto art reaches valuations higher than any, say, Frida Kahlo painting has ever achieved on the market, a total obscenity. In this context, the market boom of the 60s and 70s that Broodthaers was very conflicted about does seem quaint, right? And his, he died in poverty, to put it bluntly. He was able to continue to make art, or to make art for the 11 years he did, through the support of a doctor, Herman Daled, a Belgian doctor who, a radiologist, who bought Broodthaers' works and supported him. So you can see the class of of major art collectors has shifted from the 60s to the contemporary moment, from the the traditional bourgeoisie of the professional classes to today, when you need to be some sort of a billionaire to be investing in, again, this obscenity of crypto art. Okay, that was a long rambling answer to your question. From Dr. Bonacore, thank you so much, Dr. Stark. You're welcome for such an amazing talk. My question regards Broodthaers' poetic influences. Who do you think had a hand in shaping his way of making poetry and his concept of what is poetical? Yeah, wonderful question. It's kind of funny because his poems, the books that we saw today, are exclusively concerned with 19th century modernist poets like Baudelaire, Mallarmé, and writers, Dumas. He made other works on other figures from an earlier moment, such as, for example, Edgar Allan Poe, Oscar Wilde, are names that come up in his work. So basically, but I think we should differentiate the artists, or excuse me, the writers that he makes works about, from the work or the poetic culture that shaped him. In part, what I mean by that is that he came of age in the at the, could say, the height or the wane potentially of surrealism. He was a member of a group called the Revolutionary Surrealists in Brussels, in Belgium, whose sort of forefather was Magritte, probably the most important and famous Belgian surrealist. So he came of age in the culture of surrealism, but never in his art does he explicitly engage with this legacy of surrealism? I think it's because it was too close to it. He needed to differentiate himself from surrealism. And there's a quote that is maybe beloved among Marcel Broodthaers fanatics like myself, where he cites André Breton, the founder of the Surrealists, to the effect of, Breton writes, "I dream of a future where there will be no contradiction between reality and dream, no contradiction between reality and art, etc., etc." And Broodthaers says, nothing, no statement could, or nothing separates me more dramatically from surrealism than this statement. And so he really did want to put a distance between his engagement with surrealism and his own and his practice, or his formation in surrealism and his own art. And also another comment, this is kind of funny answering questions into a void like this. I hope I can't read your faces to see if I'm going on too long, so I'll just continue. He does not really engage explicitly with other tendencies in poetry in the 60s that one might think to be similar or in dialogue, such as the concrete poets of Brazil, the language poets, who all were very, very much engaged with the idea that poetry would become that poetic language would become a material thing, that words are objects, words are matter to be arranged rather than an ideal substance, right? So many poets of the 60s and 70s celebrated the materialization of language in their works. And so Broodthaers, you could, and I didn't do it in this talk, but I do elsewhere, compare Broodthaers with these tendencies. He, I would say, in no way celebrates the objectification of poetry. As I hope I made somewhat clear, he's extraordinarily conflicted about what the thingness of the poem, of poetic language, means. And for him, basically, it means when you become a thing, you become a commodity in the culture, the total culture of reification, and you can't escape. So that's a long answer to your question. Okay, from Don Sucha. Would Broodthaers say that all artists are looking at themselves in a mirror? Yes, he absolutely would. He did say effectively exactly that. He says that not only the foundation of his art is narcissistic, he says the foundation of art is narcissistic. And, you know, Broodthaers he stopped being a poet, as I said, in '64, but he continued to write a lot. In fact, you can have a sense, I have my prop here, of the size of his collected writings, of which poetry are as a negligible part. He wrote a huge, it's a beautiful book. He wrote a huge amount. And so he made his views, I was about to say he made his views clear, but in fact, his writing is just as difficult and hermetic as his art, just as overlaid with layers of irony. So when he says all artists are narcissists, all art is an objectification of the artist's self, that for the purpose of for the artist to gaze upon narcissistically, and that is the foundation of art. When he says this, it is difficult to know just how seriously to take him. But I think, you know, I made the sort of the claim that he is basically saying that, well, this is the social reality under which he lives, that art is narcissistic and individualistic. Why? Because our whole culture is narcissistic and individualistic. I don't want to get into debates about the culture of narcissism here, but that's Broodthaers in the 70s said, and he said in agreement with people like Lucian Goldman, that what defines the political subjectivity of reification, that is to say, political subjectivity of capitalism, is individualism, atomization, and the disappearance of the collective from the horizon of history. Lukács in the 20s, he was well, he was not just hopeful that a communist revolution and a collective subject of the proletariat would emerge in history, overturn capitalism and institute a more just society that he called communism. He was not only hopeful about it, but he participated in the Hungarian communist movement. So his book has a hope that a collective subject will emerge. In the 50s and 60s, that hope is not shared by even Lucian Goldman and Broothaers. They've lost hope for, Broothaers and Goldman, like other figures of the heterodox left from the period, look upon the bureaucracies of the worker state with extraordinary scorn and extraordinary critical eye. And so Broothaers, the question of where the hope is a different question, but he certainly sees our culture as a whole as individualistic and narcissistic. Therefore, art would simply mirror that. Okay, and finally from Dr. Ryan Pearson, for Broothaers, was the ideal of poetry as existing outside of reification still possible in the 60s and 70s, just on the condition that the poet be prepared not to make any money? Yeah, that's a great question. One must always see, if one cares to understand Broothaers, be attentive to the degree of performance in his public statements. And so when he says, I was a good for nothing, and now I'm insincere, but I'm going to make some money by becoming an artist, there is, of course, a degree of very self-conscious performance there. And of course, it's a performance because his art didn't make much money. I mean, he was able to eke out a living for himself and his family, but a very, very, very modest living. And truly, he never did live to see any sort of success on the secondary market or on that would have impacted his life financially. As I said, he lived tragically in poverty in his last decade, in his whole life, really. There are artworks that he produces in the early days where he's basically writing words, like poetic words, like figure, for example, on furniture in his house and trying to flip it effectively for on the art market. And that idea that it's somebody like hawking the surplus of their home in order to survive. It's to some degree a metaphor in his work that he's aware of, but it's also a tragic reality. And so this is not just poetry, I guess, that I'm trying to say, but art in general that he sees as being pushed into the margins. But he does consistently, and I again think with a degree of self-conscious irony, position poets as marginal figures on the edges of modern society, who were able, for potentially only a brief moment, to have a critical relationship to it before the poetic culture was over, as he then, poetic reality is over, as he said. Artists, on the other hand, he writes and talks quite a lot about artists from the Baroque period. He talks about Rubens, for example, as the quintessential artist, as artist who served power explicitly, an artist who whose patrons were the state, whose patrons were the great founders of commercial society, and of course the royalty. So for him, art has always been subordinated to power, and so when he becomes an artist, he says, I now know that I'm subordinated to power. But what is the power? It's not the royalty anymore. The power is the market. Broothaers, I'll end with an anecdote I couldn't put in my talk, but I think it's quite a funny one. Two anecdotes. Broothaers, when he was invited to or participated in a group show in 1973, 73, I believe. I'm forgetting the exact date. I think 73, with a number of other artists who are quite well known now, who are friends of his, Hans Hake and Daniel Buren, for example. Hans Hake exhibited a piece which was censored by the director of the museum before the show even opened. It was censored because it looked into the compromised history in the Nazi period of benefactors to the museum, basically. And many artists withdrew their works from the show in order to protest this act of censorship. Marcel Broodthaers wrote an open letter to the director of the museum, who had just censored the artwork of his friend. And he said, in the interest of maintaining cordial relationships with you, I offer you, as a gesture of respect, a potted palm in order to add to my art installation. So he donated an extra potted palm tree to his art installation, rather than step back and withdraw his work. So this is a performance of being compromised. Another good one I think of is when Franco was being toppled, Broodthaers put out a statement saying, in solidarity with Spanish Republicans fighting fascism, I will end the opening of my art exhibition an hour early. And so this is a kind of a parody of the artist's grandstanding politics, knowingly ineffectual in Broodthaers' case. So those are the 4 questions. I hope that I've done an all right job answering them. And we are approaching 8:30, the limit of our evening. And so I believe we should start wrapping up. What do you think, Noreen?
Well, I could listen to you go on so mmany threads from this evening, but I have the pleasure, obviously, of being able to do that as part of my day job. So I will wrap it up here, and thank everyone for joining us this evening and engaging with Trevor's wonderful talk. I'm sure you'll all join me in thanking Trevor in whatever way is possible again in this medium for his learned and illuminating talk. In thanking Dr. Lacey for his steadfast and generous support of the CIH and endowing this fellowship, Naomi Lacey Fellowship. And of course, in thanking Sean Lindsay, the CIH's coordinator, who not only kept everything running so smoothly behind the scenes this evening, but of course set it all up for us. Weeks of work always goes into these, so thanks, Sean. Please visit the CIH website at arts.ucalgary.ca/CIH and subscribe to our mailing list if you haven't already to find out more about upcoming CIH hosted events and how you can further support the Institute should you be so minded. Giving Day 2021 is coming in April. And donations made early in the giving period, April 1st to 22nd, have the opportunity to be matched up to $2,500. So it is an opportune time for maximizing any gift you may be able to make. And we anyway appreciate all your support in whatever form it comes, and hope to see you all again at upcoming events. So enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone, and keep safe and well. And hopefully we'll be back in person with these events soon. Thank you again, Trevor.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Noreen. And hopefully we'll raise a glass of wine together someday. But for now, I suppose we can all just go do it in our own private spaces.
Exactly. Thanks and good night.
Thank you very much.